what is probably the most important thing you have to get right with Agentic? And the answer is security. And so today I have Harish Peri from Okta with me, this episode of AI Insights with John Roese, to have a conversation. Harish, nice to see you here. We have been collaborating and working together to go address this problem of how does identity, access management, control, security work in the agentic world for it's probably over a year, and all the way to the point of kind of you guys delivered a new product. We have a lot of great technology. It's very early, but we have real systems, and we are going after this. Maybe just as we start, just because I don't know if everybody understands Okta, and so maybe a quick intro and share what Okta is doing and how they should think about you, and then we'll get into a discussion about
100%. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. So yes, Okta, for the last 17 years, we've been in the business of identity management, access, authorization for humans connecting to software. It's as simple as that. And we rode the wave of software as a service in the cloud and essentially secured that to ensure that the applications didn't create silos of identity, because over time, identity became a big attack vector. So that's been great. And now the new software are agents. I mean, there's all this talk about SaaSpocalypse that makes for great headlines. Yeah. But the new way in which people are going to interact with technology is through an agentic interface. You guys are leading the way on that. And the same security questions come into play: is who is this agent? Who is it acting on behalf of? What authorizations is it carrying across the various systems? And so, we're diving headfirst into securing that for pretty much every one of our customers, including you. So it's a good time to be in the agentic world.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because a year ago, most people couldn't spell agent and didn't know what one was. Today, I'm not sure everybody agrees on what one is, but I think we all agree it's an intelligent software system that, operates autonomously, reasons, interacts with other systems, uses tools, interacts with data. A very, very powerful piece of technology. And, when we at Dell started thinking about, how are we going to industrialize and deploy agents, we looked at all the layers that needed to change, because AI is not about running an app on your existing infrastructure. It actually changes almost every dimension in some way. Yeah. And the lower level stuff we know pretty well. It's going to need accelerated compute. It's going to need more capacity. It's going to need data in a different way. But when we got up into this layer of security, that's not our core business. And while we were an aggressive user of it, we started to look at the security architectures and we said, well, the fundamental technology is there. Applying them to these new things is not necessarily exactly doable. And so I remember, that's when we reached out to you guys, because we were already working on this. We said, hey, do you want to go on this journey together? And let's go figure this out. So maybe first question is, when we think about building out agentic systems, and if this is the journey we went on, do you think, it's a softball question, but I know the answer, but I think it's a good answer to give. Do you think that it is actually a prerequisite to get this worked out, to get your identity and access management in place before you start deploying agents? Or is it okay to start with the Wild West and clean it up later?
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I think there's some things that need to be pre-thought and some things that you can leave to a long tail. So the things that have to be pre-thought actually even precede identity and authorization. It comes down to what is your design pattern for your agents? Some companies will adopt the governor agent, sub-agent model. Some companies will have the central platform with domain specific like Dell has. And there's different design patterns, but that's the starting point, because that'll then dictate what is the security architecture, what is the data architecture. Now, from a risk perspective, we're learning every day, and one thing we're realizing is 20% of the agents carry about 80% of the risk. And there's two big categories. The first are enterprise agents. So these are agents that access multiple systems and that have multiple users hitting them at the same time. So you really have to think through what is the agent's broadest access scope, authorization scope, what is the chain of custody, of claims between agent to sub-agent to resource. So that's one category. And the second one is actually coding agents, surprisingly, and local agents. Because as hardware gets more powerful, and we saw some great announcements today, you're literally putting the entire internet, if you will, on a machine, and the most powerful models with trillions of parameters. And so that's great, but now you're giving those local agents potentially access to all of your sensitive resources. And so that roughly 20% of agents is what requires the highest security guardrails. And on the security side, the other thing we've learned is you got to think about model, identity, and data. And so the model side of it is things like, is the agent going to act outside of its guardrails? Is it going to hallucinate? How, is it being prompt injected, et cetera? The identity piece, of course, is what can it access and the authorization. And the data side is, you mentioned rethinking the whole stack. There is a component of literally reclassifying your entire data, your enterprise data, to say, is this agent accessing this data at this moment in time? Is it accessing data that's classified in a way that it shouldn't? So there's a set of considerations, but the reason I bring up the 80-20 thing is we find a lot of customers who just get stuck, and they start thinking about every permutation, and it becomes an academic exercise. And one thing we heard today, and our guidance to every organization is start now. There's a couple agents, you can discover them, but you kind of know where they are. Get those registered, secured, get the authorization in place. And then everything will build on that foundation.
Exactly. And we're on that journey right now. We have a very broad surface area of agentic use cases, hundreds and hundreds of agentic use cases we are now evaluating. They're really about processes and work that we think we can shift into various kinds of agents. Those agents come in different flavors. We have hygiene agents, coordination agents, productivity agents, expert agents. And it turns out that, not all of them are actually implementable yet, and we have to do some work. So our first incarnation together is we went after the inherited agents, the ones where an agent was bound to a person and it worked on their behalf. That's the kind of low-hanging fruit. We have that working, by the way, deployed, running. Thank you very much. We're doing great work together. And the next one that we're now working on that we'll have shortly is, okay, how do we deal with headless agents? Agents that don't have a human bound to them, but need their own kind of authorization. And so we're on a journey, and it's interesting as we're discovering new patterns. We're not having to completely reinvent IDM, but we're basically enhancing this technology. And so, one of the takeaways is if you're looking for a complete and final view of identity management and agents, you're not going to find it. You need to choose frameworks that are actually able to evolve as we start to use these more.
I think absolutely, and I think there's a pattern that's emerging as incredibly important, which is this whole notion of lineage. So this idea that whether it's an agent acting on its own behalf or whether it's an agent acting on behalf of user, can you trace the invoking user to the agent, to the sub-agent, to the resource? And can you maintain in a given transaction window that lineage? Can you audit it? Can you log it? Because you can bet that the regulators are going to come knocking for that level of detail. But the reason to maintain that is then by centralizing it, the other big requirement we're seeing in the market is kill switch. Which is this idea that if I do detect a prompt injection, I can kill the agent. And then the last piece is by maintaining complete context, authorization becomes very important. Now this is a little bit sci-fi, but we predict in the next 6 months it's going to be very critical. Is how do you avoid the incident that happened a couple of weeks ago where a coding assistant essentially deleted a production database, not naming names, but that was a situation where the intent likely was mismatched with the actual action. And if you at the authorization boundary can cross-check those two, in low latency, you can make a determination to block the action. So that's the kind of stuff that we're seeing as the right frameworks to think through, agnostic of the provider, but that really the kind of understanding the plumbing, understanding the runtime, and securing that is where we see the magic is happening.
Yeah, when that particular news story came out, incident, and there's been a few other ones.
Yes.
My general reaction, we actually do postmortems on them because we're like, oh, something bad happened. Let's go take a look at it. Could this happen to us? Almost universally, the conclusion we come to is bad enterprise hygiene. And in this case, it was bad enterprise authorization hygiene, bad data protection hygiene. And so it's not to pick on them, but enterprise hygiene matters. And by the way, your identity management framework is part of enterprise hygiene. If you really want to audit and control agents, if you don't even know where they are or what they are, that's a pretty bad starting point. But the reality is you have to know a lot more. You have to be able to see what they are doing. And so I'm pretty excited about the journey we're on. And I think, every iteration we're kind of developing these patterns of how these behave and what new scaffolding needs to be in place. The goal is pretty simple though. We want control. I don't want agents working without visibility and without control. I don't want to micromanage them because they're their very behavior is about letting them have a freedom of movement, giving them an objective. But that does not mean that I create the Wild West and I have chaos and unbounded risk. And so I think we're getting to that point. The nice thing, by the way, one of the most interesting conversations, we had, I think with Todd and I, this is a long time ago, and he got very excited about this word. You just used it as kill switch. Because it dawned on us early on. We're like, well, agents aren't going to just live on my platforms. Agents that do work for me might live on other platforms. And one of our rules is we enforce that a Dell identity must be granted to even agents that exist in our outer ring, which are federated. And it's interesting that one of the reasons we did that was not just to grant them access, but early on we said, if you're not running on my platform and you start doing weird stuff, I don't want to call someone up and tell them to make you stop. I want to stop you. And we realized immediately that if the identity management is controlled by us, we can revoke it, we can reset the connections, and they're gone. And that, by the way, I think I had this conversation with Todd, and he clearly agreed. And you guys have been very vocal about, look, there's one thing you're gonna need and you're gonna want just for your own sanity is the idea of a kill switch. And that's actually very real.
It's very. I mean, it's the thing that lights up. Like every customer I talk to, their eyes light up when we mention kill switch because it's weird in a metaphysical way. It's the one human control that you have on this crazy world of agents. And by the way, it's literally Article 14 of the EU AI Act. So for all of our friends in the EU, in August at some point, the law is going to drop.
Got to have a kill switch.
So kill switch, call me.
Exactly. And remember, we had that conversation a year ago. So I feel like we maybe figured some things out early here. Hey, let's talk about an adjacency that's just formed, which is the personal agent space. When OpenClaw and Hermes and NeoClaw all kind of emerged over the last month and a half or so, and they've been around a little bit longer, but they got in the common vernacular about maybe a month and a half ago. It caused a lot of a lot of reactions. Our reaction, by the way, was great. I like hybrid. I think agents should be where the work is. Work happens on PCs. I think they should have agents. I didn't have a way to do that in an orderly, standardized way prior to these things. I'm not sure these things as they exist today are exactly the answer, but we did not reject them. And in fact, the exercise that we are now doing, funny enough, is because we have an agentic set of guidelines and frameworks that you guys are a part of, and we've defined rules. We issue identity, we have authorization, we have topology, we have MCP controls, we have data protection controls. Our reaction when we looked at these is we said, okay, they're just a platform. If we enforce proper agentic hygiene on them, we can make these secure and usable. And so I'm wondering, we haven't talked about this, but I'm wondering, you guys saw these emerge too, and I wonder if that was the same reaction. These are not bad. We can just make them secure.
I mean, at the end of the day, like you call them personal agents. We think of them as like local agents. So it's because we're always thinking about where's the agent, where's the runtime? Is it in the cloud? Is it one of the hyperscalers, or is it running on your machine? OpenClaw is probably the most powerful one. Cloud Code, Cursor, Cognition, the coding assistants become one of those. If it's taking actions that are on your machine, I think maybe it's sandbox and like there's ways to control it. Where it gets dicey still is if it crosses your machine boundaries and is making an remote MCP call or remote SaaS call, then it's the same problem as any other agent. And so, what we're actually, we've created mechanisms where we can drop basically an MCP bridge inside a customer's network. And that becomes the only MCP that the local agent can talk to. And so you can still enforce centralized authorization hygiene, even if it's running on a local device. Because the people and then sometimes it's an active discussion. It's like, well, it's using the user's identity. Yes, it is, except when Cloud Code starts to write Python scripts, because 2 other execution mechanisms failed, then something gets very dicey. So please ensure that your /MCP in Cloud Code just shows one MCP, which in this case would be Okta, whatever you want your authorization engine to be, because all those direct calls, that still introduces risk. So we're game for that. I mean, if it makes people more productive, if it's the new software, go for it. Just please do it securely.
We literally just took out our agentic guidelines and said, okay, apply this, apply this, apply this, apply this. Now we're actually doing it. We have a prototype running right now. And funny enough, by the way, the reason we call them personal agents is while they do run on devices, and we like that very much, we also found that in some cases we actually run them in VMs or containers. So they are a personal agent running somewhere else in the infrastructure, but we want the behavior of a personal agent to be consistent. And in fact, what's really interesting is by having centralized identity management and by being able to do inheritance, I can have multiple personal agents working on behalf of a single human being. And I have a way to kind of correlate it back through what we built. And,
100%.
But I think you're absolutely correct. I mean, it's not what goes on inside of the system. You can't really change that from the outside. It's the boundary of it,
it's the hooks
and the blast radius and the hooks. And if you have, again, if you can authorize it and you can authenticate it and you have fine-grained controls. By the way, the other one that isn't your stuff that we realized is if you can control the data framework, if you understand, like I am not a fan of using the local file system. I would rather mount it on an NFS mount or something where I have good data hygiene, data protection. I can do rollback, snapshots. The other funny thing is we realized that like markdown files are great targets for injection attacks. But if you put them on an enterprise controlled storage environment, I can make them read only. I can know if they've been adulterated. I can monitor them. And so
you know what, so it's interesting. It actually is bleeding into our stuff a little bit. So, you know, the framework I was saying earlier, model, identity, data. Identity and data have a lot of overlap because if you just think of the arms and legs of an agent, a single agent, one of the arms or legs could be data access. So it actually, this is a good moment in time for the DSPM category or like the data classification category, because if you can introduce a whole layer of classification, then that intersects with fine-grained authorization. And you can basically say, this data call that's being executed, is my authorization rule allowed to access data classified in this way? If not, it becomes a reject. And so there is, we're seeing that there will be a lot more overlap on the identity and data side of things. And then if you layer on top of that the actual, you know, how it's stored and what you mentioned, like then it's super secure.
Well, I'm a big proponent of zero trust architectures for a very long time. And one of the first principles in zero trust is every device, person, application, or piece of data needs to be authenticated and continuously authorized. Now, most people have not achieved that. I think one of our guidance to people when they deploy agents is it is a greenfield. This is a new thing. Why would you not start with robust zero trust principles by default? Don't do it later, do it now. And so I think it starts with authentication, authorization, 100%. And then it goes from there.
You know, I have a bit of a hot take, which I think zero trust in its current definition and all the remediations for zero trust, which are all trust but verify at different boundaries and assume breach and do step up auth, and those are all fine for humans attacking humans. But when you have an agent acting on behalf of a human that could either have been compromised or is hallucinating, then the definition of zero trust changes because you've got ephemerality, you've got autonomy, you've got delegation. All these are new concepts. So I think the industry at large has to rethink what are the risk signals that behoove a additional check. And like the risk signals themselves coming from the agent runtimes or coming from the endpoint guys or from the network guys, they will feed a different set of remediation actions. So I think there's a little bit of a rethink that has to happen.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the Python code. Over 2 years ago, we built our first autonomous agents as a kind of a research project. We had a 2-agent system with a researcher writing research papers. It was the very first time we had built one. The researchers brought it to me and they were showing me this thing. I'm looking at the JSON, and it was what we watched happen was we gave them the objective of going out and grabbing the most relevant scientific papers on the topic of privacy preserving principles in AI PCs. I still remember the topic. And their goal was to build a research paper, and they had an editorial agent and a technical agent, and a researcher was helping them. And then we said, go. And the first step was to go get the data. And we never told them how to do it. And they decided to write Python to create an application to go get it. And that was my wake-up call as a technologist going, this is not the same thing I am used to. I did not expect that. And so now we have this working theory that we expect software in the world to become basically dynamically created as needed by agents. Agents will build, they're not just going to use their own tools, they're going to build their own tools. That security model is very different. But if I can authorize every piece of software, every transaction, I have a chance of keeping this under control.
Authorization is the new frontier.
So we're kind of at time, but let me ask you a closing comment. And it's more the audience here is all practitioners trying to make progress. I think this has been super helpful. Are there any kind of top recommendations you would give people right now that are actionable, that somebody should do yesterday, whether it's process or technology? Where should people spend their immediate time when dealing with securing agents? Let's focus on that.
I think the simplest thing is not even process, it's psychology. It's just start now. And when I say start now, I mean, don't worry about coming up with a grand unified theory of all agents and based on the latest thing you read on the internet. Like, no. There are some simple rules you can put in place right now, which we touched on, which is agents require their own identity. They're not users and they're not service accounts. There's something new in the middle. Think through or demand from the builders of your agents the manifest of what they're actually going to connect to. That's just good, secure by design principles. And then, actually implement one of them, implement a flow that goes from an agent where it's running through the authorization platform to the resource. Once you do one thing, then you can do 5, then you can do 15, then you can build a secure agentic enterprise. But don't freeze, start now, because in 3 months, it'll be too late.
My corollary to that is I completely agree. I've said this for decades about any big technology inflection. Sitting on the sidelines is never the strategy to win. You've got to try it. You've got to have hands on keyboard. You've got to build some of these things. The beautiful thing about agents, though, is you don't need to build the Terminator. You can build a boring agent that does something very useful, just cleaning up data, solving a hygiene problem. Agents are very powerful. They don't always have to be used for the most sexy and risky things to actually have value. And once you find one of those use cases, it gives you a platform to exercise your security, your controls, and actually do exactly what you just said. So, Harish, thank you very much. Thanks for the partnership, and glad to share some learnings here. All right,
thank you.
Thank you,
everyone.